whether they believe the police acted justifiably in opening fire on him.
Yeah, release the tapes has become the daily rallying cry at those protests. All right, Ron Mott, live for us in Charlotte. Thank you for that update, Ron. Joining me now, James Peterson, MSNBC contributor and director of Africana Studies and associate professor of English at Lehigh University, and Debbie Hines, trial attorney and former prosecutor in Baltimore. Good to have both of you with us this Saturday morning. Debbie, if I can begin with you, from a legal standpoint, how much did you learn from this video, and is there too much ambiguity for it to be used in a legal setting?
Well, we don't really see on the video what really happened to Mr. Scott, but what we do know is his wife is pleading. She's telling the police officers as they're shouting that he doesn't have a gun. She's trying to convey on his behalf that there's no imminent danger, that they should not be in fear of anything from him. She's also pleading with her husband, but it's not definitive, and that's what the police officer said even about the video that the police do have. It's not definitive of what happened, but it doesn't appear to be, from what we've seen, and we don't see everything, obviously, that there's been any immediate fear that the police are in danger.
You hear on the tape very clearly several times, I think 12 times, the police saying, drop the gun, drop the gun. And obviously in the video, it doesn't give us any visual confirmation that there was a gun. And even if so, if he had a gun, that it was in any way posing a threat to the officers. But does the fact that the police on the tape, the fact that they are saying drop the gun, does that give any legal bearing whatsoever?
No, because even the police chief said that on the video that so far the public and the media has not been allowed to see, that it does not definitively show, even on the video, that they're not showing that he had a gun. And so that's one of the more reasons why we need to see what is actually on the video. But his wife is saying that there wasn't a gun, and more importantly, why we should see the video. And I don't really think there's that much that we can account with what the officers are saying, because we saw once before in Charleston, South Carolina, where the police officers said that Walter Scott had a gun, and when we saw the actual video that was taken by a bystander, there wasn't a gun that he had. He was running away. So that's crucial. I don't really think that what the officers are saying is really accounts to much of anything right now.
And James, let me get your perspective on this. You know, if you're looking at it from the community's perspective, which is that they've been asking for the release of these tapes, what was your personal takeaway from the wife's video? I mean, did it have an emotional and substantive impact? Is it going to address some of those calls by the protesters every night to release the tapes? Do you think this will kind of calm that situation down or add more emotion to it?
I don't think that the release of Mrs. Scott's video is necessarily going to quell the calls for the release of the dash cam from this particular incident. And I'm not sure whether or not it escalates things there. But here's what we have to keep in mind. You know, there are lots of these cases in recent memory that shape how we're responding to these videos and to this particular incident. You might remember in Chicago, Eamon, the delay in release of the Laquan McDonald tape really sort of showed that the Chicago Police Department may have been trying to hide something. And so the public is looking at this situation and not really understanding why there isn't full transparency. And that's not just the public within the city of Charlotte in that region. That's the national public. We don't understand why these tapes can't be released. Why are we spending all this time parsing these different grainy photos, trying to use other videos to try to piece together this, you know, exactly what happened, when we know there's a huge piece of information that folks who we pay to protect and serve us have in their hands. And so it seems to me that it's beyond urgent for the Charlotte Police Department and for the mayor of Charlotte to go ahead and just release these tapes, you know, and we have to deal with the consequences from that point. Obviously, if you watch Mrs. Scott's tape and you hear her voice and you hear her say he doesn't have a gun, if you hear her sense of urgency, that contributes to our sense that we need to have more information to have the full picture here. But the reality is, Eamon, there have been too many of these cases, not just this week, but in recent memory, that shaped the public's perception of what is the relationship between law enforcement and the African-American community when things go sideways like this in a confrontation. I think full disclosure and full transparency is the only way to go here.
Yeah, certainly. Trust has become a major victim in all of this as well between law enforcement and the community. Debbie, let me ask you this. Given that we haven't seen the actual police video, which we understand includes both dash cam and body cam images, how difficult is it to prosecute an officer in a case like this?
Well, that's become the problem. I mean, I think that first we have to go the step of actually getting charges filed if they're appropriate. But then once charges are filed, it's always difficult based on the law sometimes to actually get a conviction. In Charlotte, once they had the case that was previously filed for Jonathan Farrell, the problem there was the jury ended up with a hung jury. Because in essence, if the police officer can basically say, I was in fear for my own life, I was in imminent fear, whether or not the person had a gun, I thought he had a gun that he was pointing at me, that creates a reasonable doubt in a lot of these cases.
Right.
And that's why video is so terribly important, to see what the video actually shows. And once the video is definitive, then it's much easier to get a conviction. But it's based on what the subjective officer's opinion is about his life, his or her life being in actual danger. So it's the video. But here you also have the wife's testimony. You would have the wife as to what she saw. And she's obviously a very integral part of what's going on. So it's really an uphill climb in most of the cases where it's not a definitive video of what happened.
James, let me play you this soundbite from President Obama. He addressed this issue in an interview. Take a listen.
If you have repeated instances in which the perception is at least that this might not have been handled the same way were it not for the element of race, even if it's unconscious. I think it's important for all of us to say we want to get this right.
So you and Debbie and I know the long list of names that continues to grow year by year, but I'm curious to get your thoughts now that we have Tulsa and Charlotte. Are there any answers on how to get this right going forward?
I think one of the steps that we've got to take is for folks, if people don't understand the seriousness of this issue, just look at the data and look at what we know on biases, and just think about what the attorney just said here, that the perception of the law enforcement officer is what the cases normally hinge on. So if the law enforcement officer perceives that their life is in danger, or they perceive some sort of hulking monster coming towards them, then that can mean that that person loses their life. And 9 times out of 10 in these cases, this is happening to folks of color and poor folks. So if you're part of those populations, and you know that your life in an encounter with law enforcement can absolutely hinge on their perception, and we understand how bias works in those split-second sort of decisions, then I think the challenges are crystal clear. So the president is right here, but we need to figure out, like, what are sort of the policy remedies here. Obviously, there are folks who are calling for a complete overhaul and reforming of law enforcement, but there certainly has to be training and a very sort of upfront sense about how bias shapes perception, particularly in split-second decision-making. And then there's going to have to be much more accountability on the other end of this. Like, we don't see enough indictments and certainly not enough trials coming out of these cases to even deter law enforcement officers or to challenge them to think more critically about their perception and their biases in those split-second decisions. So there's a lot of work that has to be done here, Eamon, and I don't know if we're moving towards progress in addressing some of the central issues in these kinds of cases.
I'm going to ask Debbie about that in just a second, but I want to ask you this really quickly, James. You're talking about the issue of racial biases. In some of these cases, you have black policemen shooting black men, and I'm curious to get your thoughts in terms of how that is affecting the way we address this issue going forward. Is it more about racial biases, or is it about police brutality?
Well, it is about excessive force, Eamon, but folks should understand that racial biases are sort of cultivated through our culture and through media, through stereotyping and through imagery, and through the ways in which folks are indoctrinated in particular institutions. And so it's perfectly possible for a black person to have a bias against black people, to have stereotypical perceptions of black people. It's perfectly logical that a black police officer trained in an American police institution could see black folks more as criminals. You might remember some of the stories from the past where you see local law enforcement using black folks as images of black folks as targets. It's that kind of culture in our institutions that can even indoctrinate someone against folks who look like them in law enforcement and in policing.
All right, James Patterson, Debbie Hines, I have to apologize because we've run out of time. I know we're going to be having this conversation for many days to come, but thank you both for your insights this morning.
Thank you.
Thanks, Eamon.
2 days before the first presidential debate, a new Reuters Ipsos national poll gives Hillary Clinton a 4-point lead over Donald Trump. So how are the candidates